Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about George Washington and a little bit more about what his presidency was like and what the government looked like, as well as the nation's capital. At the end, you'll have an assignment about George Washington, so make sure you pay attention to some of the information about his presidency, but you'll also have to do some research on your iPads. So, as we all know, George Washington was elected the first president, and this was mainly because he was one of the most well known people in the United States, all across the 13 states. Remember, he was a war hero in the American Revolution, he was one of the generals who served in the army, so he was very well liked by a lot of the American citizens. In order to help the president run the government, Congress decided to create departments for different topics that have to do with the government, such as Treasury, the Department of State, Department of War, and each department had its own secretary, and that secretary was the person who was in charge of that office. Today, we have a lot more different departments like the Department of Education, Department of Health, of all kinds of things. But back then, these three were some of the main departments that helped the president in to run the government. For example, in the Department of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton was the secretary, and he formed a plan for the economy and how to make sure people were making money for the government and how to spend that money wisely. The Department of State had Thomas Jefferson, as the secretary, and he handled affairs, issues with other countries. In the Department of War, we had someone named Knox. He was the secretary there, and he was in charge of the country's defense. So he was in charge of making sure the country had a strong army, had soldiers, and in case there was a war, he was the one who was in charge of making sure the soldiers would fight for our country. Um, these heads of departments would come together and they would advise the president, and that's what we know as the president's cabinet. So, a few days ago, when we talked about how the government was organized, we talked about the executive branch and how the president has the vice president, but also has a cabinet. And it's the different heads of department that come together to help out the president run the government. Congress also created a national court system, and we talked about that too, which is the Supreme Court. And John Jay was chosen as the first Chief Justice. So he was the head of the Supreme Court. Now let's talk a little bit about George Washington. He worked really hard as president, and he worked to strengthen the policies that government would pass. He also supported Alexander Hamilton's policies to make sure the economy ran smoothly and our country had money to pay for the different things that run our country. He also felt it was important to set a policy for foreign affairs, such as issues that have to deal with other countries besides the United States. So in 1789, France and Great Britain went to war with each other in Europe. Washington, though, decided not to take sides. So he didn't want to get involved in that war, and he didn't want to choose a side to help out. One of the reasons is because he didn't want to get involved and weaken the support from the American people. He didn't want the citizens of the United States to not support the government anymore. So he decided it was best for the United States not to get involved in the European war. He also dealt with a lot of problems very successfully while he was president. Even though it was his first time running, he was the first president, didn't really have an idea of how a country should run. The nation didn't fall apart. It also didn't lose its democracy, which means that The American people still had a voice. They still had a choice in who to vote for, and it was a government run by the people. And another success was that they didn't get involved in that European war and didn't have to lose soldiers over it or have to face any consequences with other countries. And although there were some problems that remained after George Washington stopped being the president, the future still looked bright for America. Before we had our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., it was originally in New York. From New York, it moved to Philadelphia. But in 1790, the capital in Philadelphia needed more space. There just wasn't enough space for all the heads of department, all the government officials. So they decided to use land along the Potomac River. The states of Virginia and Maryland had to give up land for this new area, and they called this area the District of Columbia. So that's what DC stands for, District of Columbia. Banneker was an African American scientist. He was also a writer. He was chosen to lay out the capital city. So he kind of made a plan of what the city was going to look like. And this was super important because he was the first African American to be appointed by a president to work for the government. Another architect named L'Enfant, he's a French architect, he designed the architecture of Washington, D.C. So Banneker laid out the plan of what the city was going to look like, but L'Enfant designed the architecture. In 1792, workers started to build the White House. So that first picture up top, you can see it's kind of like a drawing of what it looked like as they were building. And then this picture obviously is what the White House looks like today. And once it was finished, Congress met in Washington, D.C. for the first time in the year 1800. Another thing that happened during George Washington's presidency was the creation of political parties. A political party is basically a group of people who share similar ideas about the government. In the Constitution, there is nothing that talks about political parties. In fact, they think that, or in the document, it says that there shouldn't be any opposition to the government. So people really shouldn't have differing ideas about the government. But important leaders started to have different ideas from each other. And sometimes they were way opposite of each other. For example, Alexander Hamilton, his policies and the laws that he wanted the government to follow strengthen the government's power. So it gave more power to the federal government. And they also favored landowners. Remember, landowners are rich. They probably contribute a lot of money to the government. But on the other hand, we had government officials like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and their policies or their ideas supported more of the workers, the people who weren't as rich, who worked really hard for their money, and they also rather support state power over the national power. Wars in Europe also helped to create political parties because some of the officials had different ideas whether they should be involved in the war or not, or who they agreed with in the war, who they sided with in the war. One of the political parties that formed was called the Federalist Party. And in this party, it was people like Hamilton, George Washington, and their followers. They wanted a strong national government, and they sided more with Great Britain. We also had the creation of the Democratic Republicans. So back then, Democrats and Republicans were just one political party. And these supporters were people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, people who had their similar ideas, and they wanted to back up the French. Back to George Washington's presidency. He served 2 4-year terms, so in total, he served 8 years as president. He retired in 1797, and when he retired, he returned to his home in Virginia. He owned a plantation called Mount Vernon in Virginia. He released a farewell address to the Americans, to the citizens of the United States, and he praised all the good laws that were formed under a free government. He also called for more trade with other countries, and he hoped that this new country of the United States would treat other nations fairly. He led the United States through its first difficult decade. It was really hard. It's a new country. They didn't really have a guide or a book telling them how to run a country. So he led with success, and he didn't have an example to guide him. When he died in 1799, there was a congressman from Virginia who talked very highly of Washington, and he described him as being the first in war, the first in peace, and the first in the hearts of his countrymen. So, what that kind of means is that he was first in war. He was the general for the American Revolution. He was first in peace because he was there when the war ended. And he was the first in the hearts of his countrymen. So, countrymen is people who live in your country or who are from your country. So, he was in the hearts of all the American citizens. So now, once you finish watching the video, I have this as a PDF attached to Google Classroom. And what I want you to do is, using some of the information that's here in the video and the slides, you can answer some of these facts, but you also have to search up using your iPad. So in Google, you search up some of these facts, some of this information about George Washington, and fill it in. And yes, you need to decorate, you need to color in, make it look nice, kind of like a poster we would do in class. Okay? So I'll see you later. You can use the slides, the video, and the internet to help you answer this section. Okay? Bye.